Well, good afternoon. It's just about 4:45, and we're getting ready to uh, conduct a little talk with each of you today, sometimes called lecture. Uh, Chapters 4 and 14 in our textbook. Chapter 4, Theoretical Foundations for Organizations and Organizational Change, and then Chapter 14, Leading Organization Change. I had one time he had said that we were going to do 4 and 12 uh, chapters, but that was a mistake on my part. So I hope you don't get confused. And I think these two chapters complement each other fairly well. If you have a disagreement with that, please let me know because, as you may know, I've only taken over this course uh, in the last semester, and so I'm trying to improve it as we go along and always welcome your feedback. So let's get our first PowerPoint slides up. Put the share screen on so you can see them. And then, as you can see, theoretical foundations of organizations and organization change. So Burke, our author, says that organizations are like open systems. And he likens them, or he likes to use open systems theory. As you may know, open systems theory is based on biology, especially cell biology. Now, I must tell you that many years ago, well, just tell me my audio was lost. I hope it comes back. Apologize for that. All right, the audio connection is restored. And I must tell you that many years ago, I was a biology major, and we didn't talk about open systems theory. But regardless, that's where we are today. Hey, notice here that what he says is a synthesis of thinking on shifts from physics to the life sciences. So we can think of this in a way as matter and energy uh, going into a living organism. Now, it is a little bit of a stretch to say that an organization, is a living system. Organizations are constructs, and we call organizations because they match up with some definition that we have: people, equipment, land, buildings, things of that nature. But if you take anything out of that, what I just mentioned, it's no longer an organization, it's something else. You may say it's an empty organization, or it's an organization without a component part. But when you take a component part out, it ceases to be an organization. Much differently than a human, when you take a component part out of a human, the human still exists. Now, he or she is disfigured in some manner. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but in the sense that it says they're not a whole any longer. But they're still a human, and they're still taking in energy and matter from the external environment and exchanging it. Pardon me. And what he says here, excuse me, I just took the I took the screen away there for a second. I didn't mean to do that. Beg your pardon. What he says here about open systems, not only dependent, but interacting with, and they're not static. So we know, let's just put this back to a living entity. He wants to use the cell here. We know that if you deprive a cell of food and oxygen, the cell is going to deteriorate and eventually be gone. And the same thing is true with an organization. If an organization does not take in from its external environment and give back to its external environment, its demise is going to be found somewhere around, well, I shouldn't say found somewhere around, it's going to be hastened. So notice what he's using here. He calls this a continuous flow of energy. But if we think back to some of our management courses, we're talking about input, throughput, output, as the slide says. So raw material coming in, and you may have other resources coming in, like additional employees or something of that nature, but resources coming in. Going through a transformation process, that's the throughput. That could be production, could be something else. And then we have a finished product at the end, the output. He refers to this as a continuous flow, and it can be a continuous flow, although not always. Sometimes that flow is interrupted, if you will. Now, here he refers to the 10 characteristics of open systems. And I am not going to read these to you. I'm going to give you my thoughts on them. And hopefully this will improve the understanding of what's being said here. Importation of energy, simply bringing in new. Changing raw material into a finished product. Notice his next one here. Think of this as circulation, which is the same thing we talked about in the first 3 steps. Now, he showed it as linear, and that's fine because we think of it in a linear fashion. Raw product, manufacturing process, the throughput part, and then a finished product at the end, the output. But I like to think of this as the way he's talking here as circulation. And we know that blood is pumped from the heart, and it goes out through the arteries, and then it gets oxygenated, and the cells pick up food, and so on and so forth, and then comes back through the veins back to the heart, and it goes in a circular fashion. And there's some cleansing action that goes on here. Other organs are involved in that, etc. But like I said, I like to think of it as a circular pattern or a circulation. Doesn't mean I'm right, but I think it's an easy way to think of. And then negative entropy. It is best, I think, in some way to think of entropy as a degradation of matter. And so if we have a degradation of matter, then we're not going to be able to get the, again, I'm likening this to a human now, the sustenance needed to survive. And of course, that's what organizations need to do. They need something to survive. And then the last of the 5, is simply say the first one that we show here, number 6. You cannot act upon what you don't know. And that's what this means about information input. I would prefer to say what we normally get is data input. And then somebody takes that data and changes that data to meaningful information and sees that that information is disseminated to everyone who needs it. So you could say, if you want to say it's raw information, that's fine. It's just an easier way to say that. Negative feedback, I would hope you wouldn't always get negative feedback. I would hope you would get positive feedback and feedback that is meaningful. Now, it may be on the negative side. It may be saying our sales are down or something else, but it's meaningful feedback. Yeah, and so when you have meaningful feedback, a dialogue can begin. The next one, really a misnomer. And what the misnomer is we go through this text, and there's a number of different experts quoted, Kurt Lewin being one, and Kurt Lewin, someone I'm fairly familiar with. He talks about organizations being in equilibrium, but then he goes on to say that's really not the case. That on average, there will be an equilibrium, but there are highs and lows. I probably did that the wrong way. And so people think when organizations are in steady states or in equilibrium, they are really where they need to be. And that's not the case at all. So we might want to look at dynamic homeostasis, which is a little bit different because it's saying that it's not staying steady. Differentiation. That is really a necessity for organizations to stay in business. Now, let me give you an idea here of differentiation. Procter & Gamble, Fortune 500 company with headquarters here in Cincinnati, makes a number of different laundry detergents. Why? Why wouldn't they just sell Tide, which has been the leading seller of laundry detergents for many, many years? Well, they figure they need to put something out to attract people who may not like Tide for some reason. So while the product line is the same, it differentiates itself with the same product, but supposedly provides something different. Now, I use the word supposedly because I think you could clean clothes with any detergent, but some people want something different. Integration and coordination really speaks to organization norms, values, and culture. And equifinality, I'm not sure there is such a word. It says no one path to success. All right, let's try to move on here. We'll move this up just a little bit. This slide simply relates to system change. And notice what he says here. The target for change is not individuals. It is not departments. It is not groups of employees. It is the entire system. Now, let's break that down for a second. Let's suppose that you have a change that you want to make, and you want to implement the change in a specific department or division. Excuse me just a second. And that's all well and good. But you have to realize that once you implement that change in that specific area, it's going to change everything else. It simply has to. because this one department is not doing business as usual, it's going to cause other departments that interact with it not to do business as usual. So while you may only say, I need to fix department A, you're really affecting every other department that you have, whether you realize it or not. So that thought process has to go through so we understand it's whole system that you're going to change. Now he speaks here of Capra. Notice that Capra is a theoretical physicist. And this goes back to the thought process of what we were talking about here, open systems, and using now the life sciences as opposed to physics. Capra's accepted criteria for system thinking can be found on page 62 as an integrated whole. A holistic approach is, to my way of thinking, is an ecological approach because it sees what you're doing as a whole rather than the sum of the disparate parts. So if you remember something about synergy, that's what synergy says. Synergy says that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Well, that's what this is really telling you. This particular slide that we have here gives us what are known as the primary criteria for systems thinking. We're back here to the integrated whole. Notice what it goes on here, as I say, with properties that none of the parts have. It's a living system, inseparable from its various relationships, and any system's properties flow from the properties of other parts. So notice his last word, this interrelatedness determines the structure. What we have on this particular slide, to break it down, if you will, is what I prefer to call continual change. And because a continuous transformation and that it's autonomous. But that's what this is saying. There's a lot on this slide, and there's a lot perhaps connected in the text. But if we boil this down to continual or continuous change, I think we can get that concept fairly well in our minds. Now, this pretty much boils down to what I like to call perception, because this is talking about structure. I want to get that out so you can see that. Okay, we're talking here about structure, and this is bringing into everything what is included in the physical structure of something and all of its components. And so we're perceiving what we see here. And notice that in this structure, it's open to taking in and putting out, and then it's dissipative. Process. This comes down to awareness. Notice what he's talking about here. The key component or key concept is cognitive activity. The way we know things, the way we take in information and process it. And so that's what this is talking about. It's talking about us being aware of our surroundings. And of course, not only surroundings, but the structure that we work with. Now, here he is simply repeating what we have already digested about open systems, that they maintain themselves through intake and output. Semi-permeable boundaries, don't be concerned about that, but what that means is that they can breathe. So a permeable boundary in and of itself may not be living matter, although often it is. But in the case, I'm sorry I cannot answer that phone. I beg your pardon, it's phone here and I did disconnect it. So a permeable boundary means that something can go through it. So that's what we're talking about here with this input and output. Notice that he is still making this point of interaction, and it's interaction between internal. Now, remember, the internal environment in an organization is something we can control. Think of that as your family. You know, as a parent, or as you remember, your parents had a measure of control over what happened inside the family cell. You may want to say inside the home, or maybe within the boundaries of your property. Didn't control what happened on the outside, the external environment, but did everything that they could to protect you in some ways from the external environment. Things like you can't cross the street without your mother or father when you were very young. Can't ride your bicycle without a helmet. And a few other things. Of course, that's gone a little bit further today as well. But that's trying to control the external environment. And then notice what he says at the end. It is influencing, and you can influence the internal environment, your employees, and the equipment that you use, etc. And then also being influenced by what's outside. Companies act and react to the external environment. And we know that the external environment is made up of people like us, called customers, made up of regulations by government, the surrounding community, and all sorts of things like that. Now, here he brings up Capper's 3 criteria for understanding life. And let's look at these here a little bit. He really kind of was saying, in a way, what we just got through saying. And that is, when there is something that causes us, and out here I'm speaking of us as humans, pardon me, when there is something that causes us to take action, we decide which action to take. And so, for instance, child brings home a note from the teacher that says Johnny or Susie's not working to their capability. And so we make a decision whether to talk to Johnny and Susie first, Johnny or Susie, I should have said, or go to see the teacher first and get what the teacher has to say before we make a decision on what we're going to do with Johnny or Susie. So we made a selection here of what we're going to do. And notice here he talks about monitoring external environments and then adapting as necessary, or perhaps as needed is a better way of saying it, for the basis of survival. Now, in my explanation, that Johnny or Susie is not going to not survive based upon some issues at school, but their long-term survival as a student may be compromised based upon whatever we find out. It continues here. We've said this before, we really don't need to say it again. Cells depend upon what they take in outside. No cell can live within the body without having some energy. And then notice that there are many different cells in the body that interact with each other but are different from each other. But we need all of those cells to make up the entire body. Now, notice what he says here. That Capra's system, comparison of living systems, goes beyond open systems theory, because he points out that organizations' responses to the environment are selective. But notice the last one. They may be selective, but they have to address the issues as they are confronted and address them properly and thoroughly if the organization intends to remain an organization for a long period of time. And I'm sure you can think of many organizations or many companies that have been in business and are no longer in business. And many companies have had to change because they didn't keep up with the times. For instance, not too long ago, I heard that Kodak had the ingredients, or the know-how maybe is a better way of saying that, that we are taking pictures with cell phones, etc. Now, maybe they didn't envision cell phones, but they had that kind of technology. They knew it. And yet they decided to hang on to what was comfortable. But we still have Kodak today. It's radically changed. There you can think of a company that was on the cutting edge of technology when it first brought out the ability for individuals to take their own photographs. Polaroid Polaroid company was actually started by Dr. Land. That's radically changed as well. First of the instant photograph. But again, they didn't keep up with the technology. So yeah, we still have Polaroid around, but not anywhere near in the fashion that we used to have. So I had a question from a student today asking about open systems, and there was some little bit of queasiness on whether or not uh, he or she was able to understand what they were. And I used the analogy of a rock. We know that if a rock is placed in the sun, it will be heated up. We know that if it's placed in the cold, it will cool down, and if it's out in inclement weather, it will become damp from or wet from rain or snow or something else, sleet, hail. But that does not change the properties of the rock, because the rock is not a living entity. It's a rock. Yet it contains some minerals. I will admit that, but those minerals are not living. Not in the sense that minerals in our body are living. You say, okay, a rock has calcium. Well, yeah, it does. But calcium is not interacting with the rock because the rock is not a living organism. So I think that we can keep that in our mind and see the rock doesn't change because it can't. Yes, it may be heated or it may be cooled, but it doesn't do anything with those. We know if we're in a climate where the temperature is adverse, either too hot or too cold, there's something we can do about it. And we also know that our body is going to help protect us from that adverse weather up to a certain degree. I'll give you an example. We see Bedouins in the desert riding on their camels with heavy garments on. And we say, well, how can you do that in extreme heat? Well, they do it because wearing the heavy garment causes them to perspire. Of course, if they didn't have the heavy garment on, they would perspire as well. But the heavy garment helps keep that fluid close to the body. And as they're moving, because of moving, they will get some air circulated, and the air will flow through their garments and act as a kind of air conditioning system. A rock can't do that. Well, I've come to the end of what I want to speak about, chapter 4. It is 5:16. We'll take a 5-minute break, come back at 5:21 and discuss chapter 14. Thank you. Okay, it's 5:21, and we are back to talk of our last chapter for this evening, chapter 14, leading organization change. And I think that, as I said before, I think this chapter sort of really follows chapter 4. I'm being a little bit like Burke and saying I'm not doing things linearly, 4, 5, 6, etc. And I think if you learn the foundations, or we think about the foundations of organization change, then leading organization change should come next. Now, as I mentioned before, it may not be, and I would appreciate your feedback on what you think about how I'm trying to put this course together. And so feel free to send me your thoughts. This particular slide talks about the phases of change, of organization change, and the leader's role within that change. And what is the big thing to take from this slide? It says a lot of things here. More than one phase, and need to have contingency plans and things of that nature. And that's all well and good. And I don't dismiss any of it. But what this brings us back to is it brings us back to one of the fundamental functions of leaders or managers. And since we're talking about leadership, we'll keep this with leaders, and that is planning. The 4 functions: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling, although today I see them listed as planning, leading, organizing, and controlling. It really doesn't make much difference, but it all begins with planning. And that's what this slide says. It says a lot of things, mentions a lot of things, contingency plans, etc. But it's talking about planning. And if you don't have a plan for change, it simply won't be successful. This particular slide says that a leader must live with unpredictability. He or she needs to understand that that's going to happen. Remember, we go back to, I think it was chapter 2, which shows that change was not linear. Burke showed it as a sort of a corkscrew. And that's what we're talking about here, because what this simply says about unpredictability, ambiguity, whatever words you want to use, is that you have to be ready to adapt when and where necessary. Now, let's talk about some of the bullets here. It speaks about control, but you cannot micromanage. People don't like that. We're past the days of Fred Taylor. Now, we can debate Taylor's merits and demerits, and there were many merits. And as we know, we found out that some of the things today we take for granted, like Six Sigma and statistical process quality control, total quality management, had their roots in some of what Taylor had to say. What's your preference in taking action? You have to be hands-on all the time, or can you step back? Decision making. Yeah, that part of this something that you have to do, and then by the same token there, you have to step back and let others make some critical decisions. Motives and values. You bring up McClellan's 3 motives: the need for power, the need for affiliation, and the need for achievement. It's interesting to note that what is said here is the leader who has a great need for affiliation probably won't be as effective because he or she needs to be liked. And then values. If values are going to be changed, that has to start at the top. Now, I know many of us don't like things that are top-down driven, but some of them have to be. Ethical codes of conduct is one, and values is another one. If the values of an organization are going to change, that has to start at the top. And those folks at the top have to embrace that change and clearly show the reason for the change. Here he's talking about the pre-launch phase, external environment. And you have to be aware of what your customers' wants and needs are, how much you are being required to change because technology's changed. Who uses a typewriter today? Now we still do that with a keyboard. It's the same thing if you're using a PC, but it's a lot different. You have to stay abreast of what the government does and how it's changing regulations. We have a big push today from the administration to reduce carbon pollution and other types of pollution. Going to be a big fight over that. We have to stay aware of what our competitors are doing. If we don't, we're going to be left behind. And then, how is our economy going along? There's two kinds of economies, I think, in the United States. And I'm not talking about macro and microeconomics. I'm talking about the economy that is, and the economy that is perceived by the general public. If you look at a lot of the metrics that come out today, people will tell you, the economists and other experts will say that we're on the road to recovery from the huge recession that we had starting in late 2007 and mushrooming in 2008. There are other people who will say the economy is still very soft. And a lot of the people that say the economy is still very soft don't have the data that the economists do, the people in the government that put out the figures, but they don't feel like they're on top of where they need to be. And so it's that perception. Now, this is a critical slide. And what it simply says here is this. The change has to be based on some need. And people have to understand what that need is and see that the need is going to take them from point A to whatever the end point is. If they don't see that, and it's both a real thing and a perceptual thing, if they don't see it, it's just dead. It's not going to happen. There are some critical things here. This is clearly articulating what it is that needs to be done. Now, notice what's said. There's two critical words here. The first critical word is we're painting a picture of the end state, where we want to go. And the second piece is we're creating a roadmap to show you and me and everybody else in this organization how we're going to get to that end state that we want. And notice the other word is talked about here. This has to be clear. There cannot be ambiguity in this vision. And people must be able to see that. Notice here it talks about opportunity, may have an opportunity to change something. And the long-term survival of a company may depend upon this. And then the last bullet on here, you have to get people's acceptance. This goes back to what we said at the beginning, clarity, etc. But without acceptance, and this is part of this vision picture where we want to go, it's dead on arrival. So this is important to think through. This is planning. Now, what we've just talked about, according to Burke, is what he calls the pre-launch phase, a preparation phase, if you prefer. How that got up there. And of course, that's all important. But what's more important is the beginning. He calls it launch. So he talks about we have to tell people why we're doing this, why the organization has to have it, and that you need to get a solid communicator who is on board with this change from the very beginning. And he or she is credible. Now, the one thing I would differ with here is, it says it has to be somebody who has credibility for implementing change. I don't think that's as necessary as having a person who's credible. Yeah, now that they know a lot about change and how they know how to carry it forward, et cetera, pardon me. That's very important. But the credibility piece is more important than the other. Now, of course, now you have to have somebody that's not only credible, but they're capable, and that's as critical as well. Here are some initial activities, and you have to get people to listen to what you said or what you're saying, so that they're actively hearing what you want them to hear. And again, this has to be delivered in such a way that there are no distractors. Here's where we want to go. As I said before, here's how we're going to get here. And people have to understand that the kickoff is not just something we're going to do because we want to do it. It's meaningful. And it is the first step in taking us where we want to go. Well, this is always difficult. You're going to have this. You can't get away from it. There's ways to get around this. You can use rational persuasion. You can bring experts in. You can appeal to people's reason. You can use facts and figures, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to resort to coercion, although that is done. Certainly something that shouldn't be, but it is. And people have to see why it's going to happen, and they have to see what benefit it's going to be to them. Otherwise, if we go back to a few of those previous slides, we're not going to get any buy-in. Now, here, Burke is talking to us about what happens after we've started. And notice he says it's difficult. Again, we get back to this first thing he says here is this control issue. And you have to know when to let go. You can't just be hands-on here all the time. Maybe some anxious moments, maybe some ambivalence. But it's really important that the CEO stay the course, obviously is committed, and people see that he or she is focused on this. Because if they see this other stuff of concern, ambiguity, then you're going to get the followers to waffle. Now Burke quotes a gentleman by the name of Heifetz, or Heifetz, I think that's probably correct. And pretty easy what's being said here. Stay the course. I just talked about it a minute ago. But notice what he's also talking about here. Get people out of their comfort zone. As I've mentioned before, we're creatures of habit. We like to stay where we are because we feel good here. We feel protected here. We know the environment. There aren't any surprises. So we need to get people out of that thought process. And then here we get back into this resistance, although he used a different word here. We need to get people out of that resistance mode and into, we want to reach the same end state. Now here he's talking about different things like process reengineering, and that's actually a redesign. We've already talked about mission and values, mission and vision, and we understand that. We don't think about what we have to do here. You may have to do new ways of doing business. People probably are going to need to be trained as the change is being implemented, because their work processes have been changed, procedures have been changed. And at the same time, we're going to have to develop people in a new way of thinking. So training is one thing, development is another. Now we talk about them in the same breath, but they're separate. Training, we're showing people how to do something. Development, we're getting them to take on other tasks and to learn about other tasks and to expand their horizons. And you may have to have something that is different in how you recognize and reward people. Well, I don't think there's anything on this slide that should really surprise anybody here. Whoever's in charge of leading this change is walking around with a big bullseye on his or her back, or a sign on the back that says, "Kick me." Obviously, they're going to take all the grief and the grumble and everything else. And notice what it says here. Be attentive to what people are saying to you and communicate with them on the basis of being equal. Now, I don't mean that the change leader, who may be a senior management, has to be equal to a rank and file worker. But what I'm saying is equal in communicating. And then You just have to stick it out. Being patient as Job. Job is an Old Testament person who was noted for his patience. And the last thing is, when you're responding to someone, respond from a positive side, not from a side that sounds like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Well, it's just here, this means that, okay, I have a plan, and we've thought the plan out. We believe the plan will work and lead us to where we want to go, and so we're going to continue with the plan. Now, we might understand or think about, remember contingency plans, that there has to be some tweaks along the way. But if we've thought this vision out very well and the directions very well, then the broad parameters are in place, and that's what we want to retain. We can take a little short detour here or a little curve there, as long as we're staying focused on what we want to do. And notice what else he says here. Have to maintain positive energy. If anybody perceives, especially a leader of the anti-bloc, that we're backtracking, everything's gone. Everything's lost. And then the other thing he says here at the bottom is think of other ways to get this message across. Maybe pictures, maybe some kind of get-together and have a little skit or something of that nature. If people see what you're talking about, and they can see it in different ways. Here he's talking here about, again, staying the course, maybe using someone as an example who helped lead the company forward and change some years ago, and has been lionized as one of the company's heroes, for lack of a better term. Understand that there's going to be obstacles or barriers, whatever you prefer to use, and they're going to have to be circumvented, overcome, and how that's done is as part of this deal. Now, obviously, when we've gone through the pre-launch, launch, and post-launch phase, we're now come to where we are, or where we want to be. And we have to reach a solid end state, but notice we don't want to be in equilibrium, because that means we are now more resistant to change. So we want to keep this momentum going forward, and we want to maintain what we've done, not to slip back. And down here at the bottom, again, talks about things not being linear. We have to accept that and move forward. We've talked about this before, that we're going to find things that didn't go as planned, and we're going to have to make adjustments. And we need to do that. And what this says here, by the term that he's using in parentheses up there about refreezing, that is part of Kurt Lewin's 3-step change process. It is the last. First, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Lewin several weeks, but it is finding what you want to change, and he uses it as a solid state, like an ice cube. Unfreeze it, move it to the state you want to get it where it's supposed to be, and then refreeze it. So now you've gone through a change process. So we have to understand that a change usually will precipitate other things happening. And we've talked about this before, and I don't mean to beat the horse over the head here, but we have to have contingency plans because we don't always anticipate that this change is going to cause another change that we had not anticipated. Okay, so you've got the change, and now you have to keep the momentum going. And you want to make sure that you single out people who are really responsible for helping implement the change. And when you have wins, you have to celebrate those. People have to see that something has changed and has changed for the better, and we have to talk about it. And we have to, in some fashion, celebrate what we were able to do. Now, one of the easiest things to do in any change is find something that can be changed quickly and easily and get that done first. Of course, this is all in the master plan. Get that done first so people can see that you've been able to accomplish something relatively quickly. Because if you articulate a plan of change that's going to take you a year or two, most people can't see that far down the road. But they can see something that gets fixed in their area right now that's part of the overall plan. Do those, implement them, and then pat everybody on the back. Always be attentive to other things that are going to cause you to change that you may not have thought about. Now, one of the things it talks about here is choosing successors. And what this really means here is that if you have too many like-minded people, you're probably going to slip back into equilibrium, and that's not where you want to be because those folks think alike and they do things alike. And so if you are asking these kind of folks you're about to change and so on and so forth, you need a decision, you probably get a decision pretty quickly because these people all think alike. But it may not be the best decision because they're prone to groupthink. We know what we're doing. We may not be invincible, but we like to think we are. Other folks don't have all the knowledge and information that we do to make any kind of change. And so there's an insularity that develops there. He talks about bringing in new blood, but what I would say more than anything else is have different people from different areas, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. Excuse me, I couldn't get it out. That's known as a heterogeneous group. Now, the danger with a heterogeneous group is, well, there's two. One is they may have so many divergences that they can't get together to come to a decision. The other is, because they have all these different divergences, the decision process may take longer, and you may not have the opportunity to wait that long. Decisions for change, etc. And so what you may do then is revert to the homogeneous group because you can get a decision which may not be good. So if you can wait for these folks to get through their, excuse the expression, internecine warfares, you're probably going to have the best that you can get because they've thought through the process. And here he talks about launching new initiatives. You really have to go back and look at change, make sure it does for you what you expected it to do, rethink the process or processes. Maybe it's time to, as Lewin would say, unfreeze. And, or as Lewin did say, Lewin's no longer with us. And so that has to be thought about. Does the change actually produce what you expected it to produce? So this is an evaluation process, if you will, and making sure that you can do it. And then always, if the external environment has changed, maybe we need to rethink what we have done. And then finally, as he says here, we can't allow equilibrium to take over. And notice the last point. We have to survive. And so we can't get back to this comfortable business again, where we are okay with what's going on and not going out beyond it. Now, let me just end on this note. We've been here about an hour and 14 or 15 minutes. I want to end on this note. I want to talk about General Motors. In the 1990s, General Motors, and I can't tell you what part of the 1990s, although I think it was the early 90s, General Motors had all the technology to bring out an electric car. And they didn't because they bowed to external forces, that being the lowering of gasoline prices. And so they thought, because energy is now cheap for the consumer, why bring out something that's going to be more costly? Well, if anybody stopped and thought about it, said, you know, oil prices are cyclic. They go up and down. And when they go up, they tend to stay up for a long period of time, because we know. Now, they're going down now, but they're certainly not back to what they used to be. And they're not going to be there again. So it's always a good idea to do complete environmental scanning so that you understand what your opportunities are, what your threats are. General Motors would be an entirely different company today had they brought out electric technology where they could have. Well, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I will get this recorded and uploaded to Campus Web. And again, as I mentioned to you, it'll be available on YouTube most likely tomorrow. So I thank you for your attention and good night.